I rented a cheap apartment, but the landlord warned me about midnight visitors. I was desperate. I had just moved to the city with barely enough money to get by, and after weeks of searching for something affordable, I found it. A small, rundown apartment on the edge of town, the kind of place you wouldn't normally take a second look at. The paint was peeling and the floors creaked with every step. But the rent, almost too good to be true. When I met the landlord, he looked tired, like he hadn't had a decent night's sleep in years. It was an older man, probably in his 60s, wearing a faded baseball cap and a plaid shirt that seemed a bit too worn for comfort. His hands were shaking slightly as he handed me the lease agreement, but it wasn't his appearance that made me nervous. It was what he said next. "You're gonna want to lock up tight at night," he said, his voice low, almost like he didn't want anyone to overhear. "And don't open the door for anyone after midnight, especially not for the visitors." I blinked, confused. "Visitors, what do you mean?" He paused for a moment, looking around as if making sure no one else was nearby before leaning in closer. "I'm not saying anything's gonna happen, but people around here have their own way of dealing with things. Don't ask questions, just keep your door locked after midnight, all right?" I stared at him, unsure of how to respond. It was the kind of advice you'd get from an old man in a horror movie, the one who knows more than he lets on but never says enough to explain. But I was broke. I needed the place. And besides, it was probably just some weird old guy trying to warn me about the usual sketchy stuff that happens in bad neighborhoods. Right. The first few nights were uneventful. I locked the door like he told me to, double-checked the windows, and fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. I figured I was just being paranoid, overthinking the landlord's warning. But then, on the fourth night, I heard it. It started just after midnight, a soft thud at the door. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but then there it was again. Thud, thud. Someone or something was knocking, but it wasn't the kind of knock you'd expect. It wasn't the friendly, "Hey, just checking in" kind of knock. It was slow, deliberate, almost as if the person knew I was inside and was waiting for me to respond. I froze. My heart started racing as I tried to listen, but all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick. My mind screamed at me to open the door to see who it was, but I remembered the landlord's warning. No one after midnight, and I had no intention of being the next person who learned what that meant the hard way. I stayed perfectly still, not daring to make a sound, but the knocking didn't stop. It continued for what felt like an eternity. Thud, 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 and then a voice, soft, barely a whisper. "Let me in." I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was the kind of voice you don't forget, the kind that sends a chill down your spine and leaves you questioning everything you thought you knew about the world. It was a voice that didn't belong to anyone you could trust, and I knew instinctively that I wasn't supposed to open the door. I stayed quiet, too scared to even breathe. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Who the hell was knocking on my door at this hour? And what did they want? After what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped. Silence. Complete and utter silence. I could hear nothing but the pounding of my own heart in my ears. Didn't know how long I stayed there, curled up in the dark, too terrified to move. I didn't dare to check the peephole or look out the window. I just stayed there, waiting for the sun to rise, praying that the night would end. But when the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, I finally allowed myself to breathe again. The knocking had stopped, and I felt foolish. Surely it was just a prank, or maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, not even my friends. I mean, who would believe it? It sounded crazy, but deep down I knew what I heard, and I wasn't the only one. The second night was quiet, too quiet. I stayed in the apartment, the silence around me suffocating, each creak of the floorboards sounding like a distant warning. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I had just been overly tired imagining things. Maybe it was just the stress of moving into a new place, combined with the weirdness of the landlord's warning. I locked the door as always and tried to sleep, but every tiny noise made my heart race. I couldn't stop myself from glancing at the clock. Midnight came and went. No knock, no voice, no sign of anyone outside my door. By morning, I was almost embarrassed. Had I really let a simple knock rattle me so much? I convinced myself I was being ridiculous, but I also knew one thing for sure. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something about that first night didn't sit right with me, and I couldn't ignore it. I didn't know how to explain it, so I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. But I needed someone else to see what I was experiencing. Maybe if I wasn't alone in it, I'd finally be able to make sense of what happened. So I called up two of my closest friends, hoping that having them over would calm my nerves and give me some sort of rational explanation for the weird events. "Hey, I know this sounds crazy, but can you guys come over tonight? I need to prove something to myself." They were more than willing to help, even though they thought I was overreacting. Sure, we'll bring snacks and Netflix," one of them laughed, as if this was some random sleepover. The night rolled around, and I did my best to act casual, even though the thought of what might happen again was weighing heavily on me. I wasn't sure if I was hoping for something to happen, or if I wanted to prove to myself that it was all just my imagination. The apartment felt different with friends there, less lonely, less oppressive. But the unease never fully left me. We stayed up late, laughing and talking, trying to distract ourselves. The clock ticked toward midnight again, and I felt the familiar tension in my chest. I had to remind myself that nothing would happen. This time, it would be fine. Sat on the couch, the sound of our voices filling the air, but I couldn't stop glancing at the door. I kept telling myself it was just the isolation, the strange atmosphere of the apartment, and maybe too many late-night horror movies in my past. But every now and then, the silence felt heavier, thicker. And each time I glanced at the clock, I found myself holding my breath, waiting for midnight to come. Finally, the clock struck 12 and nothing. All sat there in the dim light, listening to the hum of the fridge and the occasional sound of traffic from the street. There were no knocks, no whispers. It was just the quiet hum of the night. My friends joked around, oblivious to the tension I was holding inside, but I wasn't entirely relieved. In the back of my mind, I knew I wasn't imagining the first night. I knew what I heard. And now, as the hours passed and nothing happened, I felt more unsettled than ever. Was it really just a fluke? Or was something waiting, watching, and bidding its time? I couldn't shake the feeling that the knock had been more than just an odd coincidence. It felt like a warning. But for what? And who would have waited all this time just to knock once and disappear into the night? My friends stayed the whole night, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. No strange visitors, no midnight knocks. By morning, I was starting to feel silly. Maybe it really had been just a fluke, an overactive imagination getting the best of me. The weight on my chest seemed to lift, and I even laughed a little, feeling a sense of relief that nothing had happened. But deep down, I knew I wasn't done with this. Something still didn't feel right. And I was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the only one who knew that. A week passed and nothing happened. The apartment was quiet, too quiet, almost like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. Days blended together in a haze of routine. I went to work, came home, locked the door, and tried to forget about the strange encounter from that first night. But the nagging feeling remained. Every time I passed the door, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. The silence seemed almost unnatural, like the apartment itself was holding onto a secret, something it wasn't ready to reveal. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was just an old building with its share of quirks. Still, the discomfort stayed with me, like a shadow I couldn't escape. The second week was even quieter than the first. No knocks, no whispers, nothing. I began to feel silly for ever thinking there was something sinister about it all. Maybe it had just been my nerves getting the best of me. Still, I couldn't completely shake the eerie feeling that lingered in the air. But then the rent was due. I had been putting it off, avoiding the inevitable conversation with the landlord. Thought of handing over the rent felt like a reminder that I was stuck in this place. But eventually, the time came, and I had no choice but to face it. I took the envelope with the cash and headed over to the landlord's place. He lived just a few blocks away in a crumbling house that looked even older than the apartment. When he opened the door, I couldn't help but notice how much more frail he looked than before. His hair was thinner, his face even more weathered. There was something else, something darker in his eyes, like he was waiting for something. "Rent due," I said, holding out the envelope. He didn't immediately take it. Instead, he looked at me with those tired eyes, a long pause hanging between us. Then he motioned for me to come in. I hesitated, but curiosity got the best of me. As I stepped inside, I was hit by the musty smell of old furniture and dust. House looked just like the apartment, run down, filled with things that looked like they had been untouched for years. The air was thick, heavy with time, and once again I could sense that same unease creeping up my spine. "Something been bothering you," he said suddenly, his voice low and raspy, almost as if he already knew what I was going to say. "I can tell." I didn't know what to say at first, but I had to ask. "About the visitors, the knocks. What was that all about?" He sighed deeply, running a hand over his face like he was trying to gather his thoughts. I could see how much it pained him to even talk about it. "You heard them, didn't you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded slowly, unsure how to proceed. "I've been here for years," he began, his eyes darkening, "longer than I care to admit. And I've seen things, heard things that I can't explain, the visitors. They've been coming around for as long as I can remember. It's not just the building, you see. It's the land. There's something about it, something old. People around here, they don't talk about it, but they know, they've always known." I waited for him to continue, but he just stared at me like he was trying to decide how much he should reveal. "The thing is," he continued after a long pause, "I don't know what they want and I don't know where they come from, but they don't mean any harm, they never have, they don't leave until they're ready." I stared at him, my stomach sinking. "What do you mean, ready?" He shook his head, his expression one of deep regret. "I wish I could tell you, but you'll figure it out for yourself one way or another. Just remember what I told you, lock the door, don't open it after midnight, and don't ask questions." I felt my heart race, but I couldn't bring myself to leave without pressing him for more. "Why are you telling me this now? Why didn't you just tell me all of it when I moved in?" Looked at me, and for the first time I saw something almost like fear flicker in his eyes. "Because I didn't want to scare you off, and because it's not always the same. Sometimes the visitors don't come for months. Sometimes they show up once and never again, but I'm afraid you've already had your encounter, and I'm afraid it's not the last." The way he said it made my blood run cold. "Are you saying that it's going to happen again?" I asked, barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he took the envelope with the rent money and gave me a small nod, his face grim. "Stay safe," he said quietly, "and whatever you do, don't let them in." A few days passed since my conversation with the landlord, and I tried to push his warnings to the back of my mind. I didn't want to think about it anymore. Maybe I had been overthinking the whole thing. I mean, nothing happened after that night, right? But just as I was starting to feel normal again, something shifted. It started with a knock. It was late, maybe a little past midnight. At first, I didn't think much of it, chalking it up to the usual noises of an old building settling. But then it came again. Soft at first, then louder, more insistent. Thud, 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 I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I knew that sound. It was the knock, the one I had been dreading. I looked at the clock. Midnight exactly. I wasn't about to make the same mistake twice. I stayed where I was, tucked under the blankets, not daring to move a muscle. The knocking stopped for a moment, and then voices. Hey, it's me, open up. It was my friend Lisa's voice. I exhaled in relief, but the relief was short-lived. Something didn't sound right. I got up slowly, my hand shaking as I crept toward the door. I didn't dare to look through the peephole right away. I knew I had to be careful, but the instinct to check was almost overwhelming. I finally mustered the courage and pressed my eye to the peephole. It was her. Lisa standing there just like I expected. But there was something off. She wasn't alone. Two other figures stood behind her, faces shrouded in shadow. Come on, open up, it's cold out here. Lisa's voice was urgent, but there was an odd edge to it now, almost like a whisper hidden beneath her words. I stepped back from the door, my pulse racing. Something was wrong. I could feel it. Wanted to believe it was them, but that whispering tone, it wasn't right. I walked quietly to the window, peeking through the blinds just enough to see outside. The shadows of the two people with Lisa were still there, but now that I could see them in the dim light, I noticed something strange. Their movements were jerky, almost robotic, like they were pretending to be real, like they were waiting for something, waiting for me to let them in. I held my breath, trying to steady my racing heart. There was one small thing that caught my eye, a tiny detail that made everything click into place. Lisa always wore a silver bracelet. It was a thin, delicate thing with a charm that had her name on it. I'd known her for years, and that bracelet had never left her wrist. But now, as I looked out the window, I saw her wrist bare. Nothing, no bracelet. My stomach churned. This was Lisa. This wasn't her at all. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. This was it. The visitors had come. As strangers, not as the eerie, ominous figures I had imagined. They had come as something else, something familiar, something I thought I could trust. I could hear the voices outside growing more desperate. Why won't you let us in? We're your friends. The voice was still Lisa, but now it was almost pleading. We need to talk. Open the door. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I forced myself to speak. I know it's not you, I said, my voice shaking but firm. I'm not opening the door. I know what you are. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard the sound of a soft chuckle. It was Lisa's voice, but a low, distorted version of it. Smart girl, the voice said, but it doesn't matter. You'll open it eventually. I stepped back from the door, my back pressed against the wall. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my mind spinning. Didn't know how long I stood there, but the knocking continued, gentle at first, then turning into a rhythmic pounding. The kind that echoes through the apartment, through your bones, telling you that you can't escape, that you can't hide. But no matter how badly I wanted to open that door, no matter how much the voices tried to coax me, I knew I had to resist. The little detail about the bracelet, that was all I needed. They weren't my friends. They weren't anyone I knew. This time I wouldn't make the mistake of letting them in. I stayed there in the dark, listening as the knocks grew louder, more frantic. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. Silence. I didn't know if they were gone or if they were just waiting, watching. But one thing was for sure, I wasn't going to open that door again. The silence after the knock lasted longer than I expected. I stood there, pressing my back against the wall, my heart still pounding in my chest. I waited for the sound to return, footsteps, whispers, anything. But the only thing I could hear was my own ragged breath. I stayed in the same spot for what felt like hours, just listening. Eventually, I mustered the courage to step away from the door. I tried to go back to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. The apartment felt different now, as if it had changed overnight, like a layer of darkness had settled into the walls, pressing in on me from all sides. Next few nights were eerily quiet, but the feeling of being watched never quite went away. I tried to go about my life as usual, work, errands, the mundane things I had to do. But every time I came home, the atmosphere of the apartment seemed thicker, more oppressive. It felt like I was walking into something that didn't want me there, as if the apartment itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. One night, as I lay in bed, I thought I heard something moving in the apartment. First, I convinced myself it was just the old building settling. But then I heard it again, footsteps. Soft, deliberate steps padding across the floor in the hallway outside my bedroom. I froze, holding my breath, trying to listen more closely. I told myself it was just the neighbors upstairs. Maybe the pipes were rattling. Maybe the wind had blown something against the walls, but the steps continued, and they weren't coming from anywhere else. They were coming from inside my apartment. I sat up in bed, the room darker than I remembered. My eyes darted around, trying to pick out any movement in the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the flickering light of the street lamp outside, casting faint shapes on the walls. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but the steps stopped, just like that. Gone. My heart was hammering in my chest. I didn't know whether to be relieved or more scared than I'd been before. I turned over and closed my eyes, telling myself I was imagining things. Hadn't heard footsteps. There was no one here. It was all just in my head. But that night, the dreams were worse. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart racing. My pulse was so loud in my ears, I could barely hear anything else. For a moment, I just lay there in the dark, trying to calm down. I didn't know what had woken me, maybe the nightmare, maybe the sound of my own breath. But then I heard it again. Wasn't footsteps this time, but a low hum like someone was whispering just outside my window. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was more like a buzzing sound, a whisper so soft that I could barely make it out, but it was there. And it was coming from outside my window. I couldn't bring myself to move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an old fan that had been left on somewhere. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. I stayed awake for hours, listening for any other sound, but there was nothing. Just the soft hum of my own fear, buzzing in my ears like the whispers that wouldn't go away. The next night, it was worse. I felt something move in the corner of my eye just outside my bedroom door. I quickly turned to look, but nothing was there. The shadows in the hallway were as still as always. But my eyes kept darting back to the door, to the crack between it and the floor, where I could almost swear I saw something shifting in the darkness. Told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the lack of sleep was getting to me, or maybe I had too much caffeine earlier in the day. But every night it was the same creeping sense of being watched, the same unsettling feeling that there was something in the apartment with me, even though I could never find it. The nights grew longer. The whispers grew louder. But when I looked out the window, or checked the hallway, or peeked through the crack in the door, there was nothing. Nothing but silence. It was as though the apartment was alive, and it was trying to tell me something. But no matter how hard I listened, I couldn't make sense of it. It happened again. Only this time, it wasn't just the soft hum of whispers or the faint rustling in the corners of my apartment. This time, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone outside the door. Thud, thud, thud. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The knocks were louder than before, much louder. It sounded like fists pounding against the wood, each thud echoing through my veins. My heart pounded in my chest, and I sat there, stiff as a board, staring at the door. Please no, I whispered to myself, barely able to breathe. I didn't know if I could go through with this again, but the pounding didn't stop. It grew louder, faster, more frantic, like someone was trying to break in. And then, just as suddenly as the knocking started, the door gave way with a deafening crash. I jumped out of bed, my mind racing, my limbs frozen in fear. The sound of splintering wood filled the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, making their way inside. My stomach turned. I wanted to run, to hide, but the apartment felt like a maze I couldn't escape from. Shadows loomed at the edges of the room, and the once familiar place now seemed like a nightmare come to life. I stumbled into the corner of the room, my hands shaking as I fumbled to turn off the lights. The darkness enveloped me, but I knew they were there. I could hear them, feel them, moving through the apartment like they owned it. Their footsteps were too loud, too close. They were searching. I pressed myself against the wall, holding my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. They were getting closer, and I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. The sound of furniture being overturned, glass breaking, and the crashing of objects filled the air. It was like they were tearing everything apart, destroying the apartment as if it was nothing more than a toy. My heart raced as I realized they were coming for me. I didn't have much time. I glanced around in desperation, looking for somewhere to hide. But all I could do was crawl under the bed, curling into a small ball and hopping, praying that they wouldn't see me. I heard them getting closer, the sound of their footsteps growing louder, moving down the hallway toward my room. My breath caught in my throat as I heard the creak of the door opening. A chill ran down my spine as I heard them enter the room, moving slowly, deliberately, like predators on the hunt. I dared not make a sound, barely even breathing, my entire body trembling. Then I heard them. "Where are you?" It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was low and guttural, almost inhuman, like something trying to imitate human speech. They were looking for me, and they weren't going to stop until they found me. My heart hammered in my chest, my body trembling uncontrollably. I could feel the floor shift beneath me as they moved around the room, searching for any sign of life. I had to stay quiet, stay still. I couldn't make a sound. But then something changed. One of them, its shadow cast long and twisted on the floor, moved closer. I felt the air grow cold, the hairs on my neck standing on end. They were right next to me now. I could feel their presence, their breath, as if they were just inches away. I didn't dare look up, but I could feel their hand reaching down. I closed my eyes tightly, bracing for what was coming. And then, suddenly, everything went black. I shot up in bed, gasping for air, my heart racing like I had just run a marathon. Sweat soaked through my clothes, my breath still erratic, my chest heaving. For a moment, I just sat there, disoriented, trying to gather my thoughts. It had been a dream, a nightmare, but the fear still gripped me, like I could feel the cold presence in the room with me. The door had been broken down, the apartment destroyed, and the visitors. They had almost reached me. I could still hear their footsteps in my head, the low, guttural voices calling for me. My skin crawled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, waiting for me. But when I looked around, the apartment was just as it had been before. Everything was quiet, still. It was a nightmare, but it felt so real. The terror, the urgency, it was all still so vivid in my mind. Swallowed hard and tried to steady my breath. I was safe, I was awake, but the feeling lingered. It felt like I hadn't really woken up at all, like I was still trapped in that nightmare, still hiding in the darkness, waiting for them to find me. I glanced toward the door, half expecting to see it shattered on the floor, but it was still intact. The apartment was still normal, but I knew deep down that the nightmare had been a warning that I wasn't safe. Not yet. And then I heard it. A knock. Just one, soft and deliberate. Thud.